Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time, and we may have to do that because of the vote schedule this morning. And I now recognize myself for my opening statement. Every 4 or 8 years, our nation has undergone a peaceful transfer of power. 1981, for example, another one-term president handed over the reins of government to his election adversary, Ronald Reagan. In the wake of the election, President Jimmy Carter calmed the nation, saying, "We'll have a very fine transition period." I told him I wanted the best one in history. President Carter even sent incoming President Ronald Reagan a telegram that read, "It is now apparent that the American people have chosen you as the next president. I congratulate you and pledge to you our fullest support and cooperation in bringing about an orderly transition of government in the weeks ahead. My best wishes are with you and your family as you undertake the responsibilities that lie before you." Unfortunately, our nation is yet to see that kind of graciousness in a telegram or tweet this time around. I call this hearing today to examine the laws, norms, and administrative practices that make a peaceful and efficient transition possible. What have we learned over 36 presidential transitions that have followed presidential elections? The first one, of course, was President George Washington relinquishing his office to President John Adams. And what improvements can we make for future transitions? The transition currently underway to the Biden administration marks the 25th presidential transition when the incoming president is of a different party than the outgoing president. This election was the first in 28 years in which an incumbent president sought re-election and failed. And only 10 times in our nation's history has a sitting president lost a re-election bid. This context looms large over Congress's job to ensure that the transfer of power remains peaceful, but occurs. The transition period between administrations is when our nation often is at its most vulnerable. In 1932-33, for example, at the peak of the Great Depression, then President Hoover and President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt failed to cooperate, delaying much-needed relief to a starving public. In February 1993, shortly after Bill Clinton's inauguration, terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York City the first time. In 2009, President Obama was inaugurated during one of our nation's most severe financial crises since the Great Depression, and America is practiced in transition during duress. This transition, in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic and economic stress, is no exception. Even in the smoothest of transitions, a president-elect and vice president-elect have between 72 and 78 days in which to take the reins of the federal government. In the 2020 transition, the General Services Administration delay in ascertaining the winner of the election has cut the post-election transition period to just 57 days. The loss of 20 days is consequential, both to the incoming administration and, more importantly, to the nation as a whole. In 57 days, the president and vice president-elect must staff the White House and the executive office of the president and create a government structure to organize, prepare, and train teams to lead the more than 100 departments and agencies in the federal government. These teams will be the point of the spear that works throughout the next administration to reinvigorate the more than 2.1 million civilian employees, 3.5 million contract employees, and 1.3 million military employees who serve and protect this nation every day. And that's just one transition responsibility. As you can see on the screen, during the next 41 days, the Biden administration will be preparing to make more than 4,000 presidential appointments, roughly 1,200 of which require the Senate's advice and consent. Many of those appointees will need to undergo thorough, time-consuming background investigations. As I've already noted, this new administration is taking these steps in the midst of a global pandemic that's worsening by the day, really worsening by the day. These individuals will inherit the top positions of a nation in need of economic stimulus more than ever. They inherit a country where racial tensions have been stoked over the past 4 years. Setting up an effective transition team is a tall task, and it highlights the importance of getting the things right and helping this administration get the leaders, support, and resources it will need to bring this nation back from the brink. The primary law that governs the transfer of power is the Presidential Transition Act of 1963. As you can see on the screen, the law has been amended significantly 4 times to address lessons learned from previous transitions. Prior to presidential elections, the law requires eligible candidates to establish a transition-related organizational structure, making sure that would-be presidents are prepared for the post-election sprint. The law also authorizes funding for office space, staff compensation, and other transition services for the president and vice president-elect and their team. Importantly, the law also outlines the process by which candidates can designate and start vetting candidates who would fill important national security or other sensitive roles in the incoming administration. This law is meant to ensure a new president is ready to lead on day one. In the transition from George Bush to Barack Obama, the Obama-Biden transition team had more than 349 individuals cleared to enter agencies to learn about their operations and engage the workforce for the transition. In 2016, President-elect Donald Trump had 323 people cleared to enter agencies. Setting up a transition team is like designing the nation's largest startup company. This year, those teams are taking the baton on vaccine production and distribution, economic relief, and they face a president who could very well be facing a conflict with Iran that could affect our national security directly. The stakes are high. They couldn't be higher. Pursuant to the Presidential Transition Act, it's the administrator of the General Services Administration who triggers access to transition funding and office space. In the wake of this election, the administrator inexplicably made what should be a ministerial decision into a political one. At this hearing, we'll examine ways to amend the Presidential Transition Act to put clearer guide rails, which I might add, the administrator of GSA has invited Congress to do, on what it means to ascertain a presidential election and the winner. We'll also examine at this hearing the role of Congress during the lame duck period. We have a responsibility to ensure that this administration does not place political appointees who lack qualifying expertise into the competitive civil service, or promulgate so-called last-minute midnight regulations, or fail to properly collect, retain, and preserve presidential or federal records. In addition to those political appointees who have borrowed in or who seek to, this administration has taken the troubling step of issuing an executive order that would potentially enable President Trump to fire scores of federal employees on his way out the door and replace them with his political appointees. This strikes at the heart of a merit-based civil service. This order removes civil service protections from federal employees, stripping their statutory appeals rights and permitting them to be replaced with political appointees. The order undoes 137 years of merit system hiring and expertise in our federal workforce and could be a harmful attack on the integrity of our government. I want to make the moment right now to insert into the hearing record several resources that underscore the intense bipartisan opposition to this executive order creating a so-called Schedule F, including an op-ed from 50 former career officials and political appointees from the Office of Management and Budget, and another letter from 22 good government organizations and scholars, including the Partnership for Public Service, which Mr. Steyer represents here today, and we'll hear his testimony. A presidential legacy should be earned over 4 years, not panic dumped on a nation 6 weeks before the outgoing president leaves office. That's why today I plan to introduce the Midnight Regulations Review Act with Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney, Chairman Raja Krishnamurthy, and Representative Jackie Speer. The legislation would require the Government Accountability Office to create a list of the regulations that the outgoing administration promulgates during the lame duck, which would allow Congress and the incoming administration to review whether they're based on evidence and research or whether they should be considered for amendment or elimination. Congress must take stock immediately of harmful regulatory actions rushed by any outgoing administration in order to exercise its authority to repeal regulations pursuant to the Congressional Review Act. The bill also builds on the bipartisan work of Senate colleagues Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, and Tom Carper of Delaware, requesting that GAO produce a report similar to the one we're going to require a year after the inauguration to examine more in depth the impact of specific midnight regulations. The nation needs the next administration to be a success. We need our people to stay safe and healthy during what promises to be the deadliest stretch of the pandemic yet. We need vaccine production and distribution to be comprehensive and efficient. We need to prevent small businesses from collapsing and keep renters and homeowners with roofs over their heads. We need to heal the acrimony that divides our nation. To make that possible, we need the outgoing administration not to burn the building down on its way out. We need a new team to have the opportunity to restore what makes America great. It's time we put our nation before our political party. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I now call on the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Heiss, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just like to say I noticed that Mr. Sarbanes just joined the conference, the hearing today, and it's my understanding he just lost his father yesterday, and I just want to extend my condolences. I know I lost my dad about a year ago, and prayers with the Sarbanes family. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Mr. Heiss, if I could interrupt and without penalizing your time, I had the privilege of working for Paul Sarbanes for 10 years in the United States Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee. He was a towering figure. He perhaps had the most penetrating intellect I've ever worked with or for, certainly in the United States Congress. He was quiet, but he was effective. He was the kind of go-to guy where people on bipartisan basis sought counsel and guidance and insight. And that's how he exercised enormous influence in the U.S. Senate on a range of issues. And of course, Sarbanes-Oxley is named after him, but that only begins to frankly penetrate his influence on the United States government and certainly the U.S. Senate over those years. So, John, our hearts go out to you and the family. I know you're proud of your dad. It was a privilege in my life and career to have spent 10 years working with him. Thank you very much for allowing me.
I appreciate that very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. Thank you for taking a moment to pass your greetings and thoughts. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and it's very heartfelt, our feelings towards you and your family. Thank you, Chairman Connolly, for calling this hearing regarding the ongoing presidential transition. This year's transition highlights a number of significant shortcomings in the governing statute for transitions, and I think this is something that we all need to look at. At present, it's ultimately a judgment call by the GSA administrator as to when a victor is apparent in order that they can ascertain the winner before providing post-election funds or services. It's very difficult to operate under the statute of apparent sometimes, and that was certainly the case this year. As I personally made clear in a letter to the GSA on November 13th, even the drafters of the Presidential Transition Act contemplated that an ascertainment should not be made if the results were uncertain and unapparent. Again, that was certainly the case this year. With no guidance or clarity, GSA looked to the precedent set under the Clinton administration in 2000 when it waited until December the 12th decision in the Bush versus Gore in order to make an ascertainment. We certainly have not waited that long. Looking for some element of official action before ascertaining a winner, which ultimately came when key states certified their election results, was an acceptable course of action given the ambiguous nature of this year, as I mentioned earlier. I encourage GSA to do what they are supposed to do, which is to follow the law, not to react to the vitriol being spewed by the political left, enabled by the mainstream media, which quite frankly has become nothing more than their propaganda arm. This led to threats of violence against Administrator Murphy and her staff. This is shameful. It's shameful behavior by everyone who is involved. To those who shriek about the Trump campaign exercising its right to contest the results, I would say it's a bold talk coming from a group that for 4 years has refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of President Trump's victory and his presidency, even to the extent of calling for impeachment before he was even inaugurated, even having investigations and spying into his campaign. And perhaps those are the types of things that the chairman was referring to about this administration not exercising those types of behaviors if there is a transition coming now. When you look at the collusion accusations from the Obama administration, the Clinton campaign, the FBI, and even a Russian agent, all to fabricate a false narrative of collusion against the Trump campaign, this is unbelievable that we're looking at and even making accusations potentially of the Trump campaign right now. Not to mention, as I already, referenced, a kangaroo court on an impeachment trial. The reality is that Joe Biden himself has provided an answer to all of this. He said, quote, I think we're going to not be so far behind the curve as we thought we might be in the past. There's a lot of immediate discussion, and I must say the outreach has been sincere, end quote. That coming from Joe Biden himself. Moreover, GSA has been working on the transition for over a year and has provided the Biden campaign resources as early as September, back when Democrats were campaigning on promises to defund the police and implement the Green New Deal. It's not true that the less than 3 weeks, it was less than 3 weeks that I want to emphasize. It's not true that the less than 3 weeks that GSA waited somehow put our national security at risk or delayed distribution of a COVID-19 vaccine. The truth is that Joe Biden had pre-election resources made available to him, and plans for COVID-19 vaccine distribution were well underway. And like the George W. Bush scenario in 2000, nothing prevented Joe Biden from vetting and selecting the individuals he intends to nominate for key positions during those 3 weeks or even before the election. The Trump administration should actually be applauded for their endeavors both pre and post-election. Personally, what I'm concerned about are the many constituents in my district and beyond who don't have confidence in whether the vote was accurately even counted. I'm concerned Democrats have completely ignored the question of election irregularities and have done exactly nothing to investigate them. Mr. Chairman, I hope that at some point we will be able to look at those things, because that should be bipartisan. Election integrity impacts everyone in our country and, of course, the entire direction of our country. And I hope we'll be able to go down that path at some point in the future. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss. And certainly if there are irregularities, we want to know about them. I will point out for the record, the Republican coordinator for the mechanics of elections in your home state of Georgia actually has stated publicly that there were not such irregularities, and that indeed Joe Biden had won the election. And with respect to violence, he had a press conference condemning threats of violence against him and other Republican officials in your state who had the intestinal fortitude to defend the results of the election. I might add that all of that was also reinforced by the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is also a Republican, and who also reiterated that in 3 checks, the results are the same. President-elect Biden has won the electoral votes of Georgia, and that there was no evidence of fraud or substantial irregularities of any kind that would materially affect the outcome of the election. So we can do that, but I guess in this particular case, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I am fully aware of those that you referenced. I'm also fully aware, both in the House and the Senate, and in multiple lawsuits and in multiple other ways. We have hundreds, we have thousands of affidavits of irregularities and potential voter fraud. And regardless of a Secretary of State who is trying to hide his own political career in trying to convince people there were no irregularities. The facts point otherwise, and I hope that we will be able to look into these. Again, the election security and integrity impacts not only Georgia, it impacts our entire nation. And where those accusations are severe and alarming, I think it's incumbent upon us to look into it. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished chairwoman of the full committee for her opening statement. Chairwoman Maloney, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Connolly and Ranking Member. I thank both of you for calling this hearing, and I would like to be associated with your remarks on the loss of our great friend and colleague, Paul Sarbanes. He was an iconic leader and legislator. It was my honor to work with him on working for stronger relations between Greece, Cyprus, and America. And I worked with him on financial regulation and bills as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He had a towering impact on legislation that will help this country for decades to come. Most notably, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that really brought accountability to corporate America, more transparency, and really accountability to the American people. He was a towering figure and a really great person. And we join you, John, in mourning his great loss. Now I'd like to thank Chairman Connolly very much for highlighting the many issues that have been raised by this unstable transition. An outgoing president should make every effort to assist and prepare the incoming administration to take office for the good of the country and for our national security. Instead of working to ensure the orderly transfer of power to the winner of the election, President Trump has been attacking the validity of the election and subverting the transition process. These actions are not only reprehensible and shocking, they're dangerous, but I'm sorry to say that I'm not surprised. Throughout his administration, President Trump has chosen to put his personal interests before the needs of the country and has disregarded both congressional oversight and, I would say, public scrutiny. According to press reports, he has ignored federal records laws, regularly tearing up or shredding documents that are required to be preserved. The destruction was so bad that career records officers were reportedly forced to use Scotch tape to put important documents back together. Given this track record, I'm deeply concerned that President Trump and his aides may attempt to conceal or destroy important White House materials during their last remaining days. That's why I sent a letter to the White House last month demanding the administration comply with their responsibilities under the Presidential Records Act and the Federal Records Act. 8 other committee chairs joined me in this letter, and we jointly demanded that the White House preserve all materials that are potentially responsive to the requests and subpoenas issued by this Congress. These records belong to the American people. They are important for our historical record. They will also be critical to our ability to fix the damage that has been done during this administration. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today on this and other issues that need to be addressed to ensure that the current transition goes as smoothly as possible from this point forward. We must also work to ensure that future transitions are more seamless than this one. Thank you, and I yield back.
Crevices that have been exposed during this transition. Mr. Comer, the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, are you with us?
Yes.
You're recognized for an opening statement. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairman Connolly, and for all the witnesses appearing here today. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Heiss for his leadership in this area, particularly the letter he sent to the GSA administrator advising her about the requirements of the Presidential Transition Act and encouraging her to stand strong and follow the law in face of great opposition. We should all be thankful for public servants like GSA Administrator Emily Murphy, who followed the law, even as she was vilified in the media and received thousands of threats against herself and her staff. Government officials take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws passed through our government, and her adherence to the Presidential Transition Act as written should be commended, not lamented. The Act provides no clear guidelines for how the GSA administrator should proceed when elections are contested, and this is something that needs to be fixed. I suspect Democrats will attempt to portray the 3 weeks that passed between the election and ascertainment as incredibly detrimental to a Biden administration, a ready excuse for anything that goes wrong. But the real work of transition, choosing and vetting a team, begins well before the election and doesn't have anything to do with GSA. And indeed, Joe Biden himself and people close to him have said the transition, quote, has been fairly smooth. Vaccine distribution plans have been coming along, although if memory serves, some Democrat governors aren't that eager about a vaccine developed under President Trump. As for access to the president's intelligence briefing book, it might have made the country safer having a 3-week delay, given the ties of the state and DNI nominees to China. I will end by echoing Ranking Member Heiss's concerns shared by my constituents, that widespread voting irregularities and even reports of outright fraud may have disenfranchised their votes. So I would echo his call for this committee to hold hearings to examine this election to ensure that our constituents can be confident that their vote counts. Thank you, and I yield back.
Your remarks. I now want to introduce our 3 witnesses, and I will note that votes have now been called. There are 2 votes in this first and last series, so there will be some interruption. My hope is that we can continue to do the hearing. Ms. Norton, I may ask you to take over the chair while I vote, if you can do that.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, and until I'm able to vote, I'm always available.
You are wonderful.
Until the DC statehood bill passed. Thank you.
Exactly. I look forward to the day where I can ask you for this favor. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Our first witness today is Martha Joint Kumar, who's the director of the White House Transition Project. Then we'll hear from Max Stier, who is the president and chief executive officer of the Partnership for Public Service, which has done a lot of work on transitions. And finally, we will hear from Lisa Brown, who was the co-director of agency review for the Obama-Biden Transition Project. If the witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear you all in, as is the custom of our committee. And if I can see them, if you can put them on the screen so I can see them. Max Stier and Martha Joint. I see you all. If you'd raise your right hand. Do you swear to or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I do.
Let the record show that all of our witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. And without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Kumar, you are now recognized for your 5-minute testimony, and we welcome you before the committee.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Connolly, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Heiss, and Ranking Member Comer. And I'd like to say a word about Paul Sarbanes As a professor at Towson University in Baltimore, Senator Sarbanes was very generous with his time to students, and both in having students in his office as interns and as meeting with them, the sessions that the students greatly prized. Following the hearing theme of the elements of a presidential transition, I would like to briefly explore three elements that are important aspects of recent transitions. First, the strength of the 1963 Presidential Transition Act. In the 58 years since the President and Congress formally considered transition legislation, the two branches have done so in a bipartisan manner. As the stakes in a smooth transition rose, they increased the resources and the government institutions involved in transitions. The General Services Administration was the lead transition institution in 1964, but now a presidential transition is an all of government operation with the president playing a lead role along with his departments and agencies. Changes in the political environment, national security concerns, transition experiences, and the increase in the complexity of government all have played into the development of the current shape of transition planning. The two branches have constructed a transition framework that now moves up the clock to after the major party nominating conventions and provides funds to both party candidates, not just a president-elect. Laws also provide for an information structure that calls upon the president to create a council setting transition policy for departments and agencies. Second, tacit understandings between presidents and presidents-elect. And as important as the transition laws have been in creating a supportive framework for presidential transitions, equally important is the support presidents have offered to their successors. Until this year, incumbent presidents who lost their campaigns for reelection have quickly conceded their loss and secondly called upon their staffs to pave a smooth road for the president-elect and his team. George H.W. Bush, our most recent one-term president who ran for reelection, instructed his White House senior staff the day following his 1992 defeat to, quote, be helpful and leave no ticking time bombs for the incoming Clinton administration, according to his White House economic and domestic policy advisor, Roger Porter. The voters have spoken, Bush said, and our job is not to make the task of the incoming administration more difficult than it would otherwise be. Third, planning their own truncated transitions. Both George W. Bush and Joseph Biden were stalled for weeks from receiving the information and materials developed for them and their staffs. Instead of 75 days, their transitions were limited to 37 and 57 days, respectively, prior to Inauguration Day. Yet both developed strategies that ameliorated their situations. In their campaigns, both Biden and Bush focused on a digestible number of issues that they could easily translate into governing priority proposals. Both men focused first, putting a presidential decision-making system in place by constructing a White House staff prior to choosing their cabinet secretaries and announcing their policy initiatives. Additionally, Bush and Biden set up functioning personnel systems well before the election in order to have a team in place. Dante Fascell, the sponsor and floor manager of the first Presidential Transition Act, had a goal of institutionalizing transition process based on access to information and cooperation from government officials. His goal has been met almost all the presidential transitions since the act became law in 1964. Congress and the president recognized then and continues to acknowledge the importance of an effective transition to a good start for a new president. Having a well-organized operation developed early in the election year benefits a president and the public as well. With an experienced and knowledgeable staff, an incoming president can seize the political momentum and establish his brand of leadership at a time when the public is paying attention. Transition law has provided presidents opportunities to gather information.
Ms. Kumar, if I could just ask you to sum up, because we're trying to ask everyone to do a 5-minute summary, and then we'll get into questions afterwards.
Well, I just have two more sentences.
Okay, great. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, that's the transition law has provided presidents opportunities to gather information they need and to enable them to deal with the national security challenges that inevitably rise in the early days of an administration. With a late start to the 2020 transition during a time of a pandemic and with an economic crisis as well, we may be at a point for Congress to revisit transition laws and assess where there are needs for legislative fixes.
Thank you so much. And it was nice of you to mention Dante Fascell. I knew Dante very well and worked with him when I was a young Senate staffer before he was chairman of our committee and after he became chairman of our committee. And he was a great American. Thank you for remembering him.
He was very important to the development of the legislation starting in 1962.
Yep. Mr. Steyer, you are recognized for a 5-minute piece of testimony. And of course, your full statement will be entered into the record. Welcome.
Many thanks, Chairman Connolly and ranking members Heiss and Comer for this hearing and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with Martha Kumar and Lisa Brown, who are phenomenal colleagues in this area. We've heard a lot already about how important presidential transition is. It is ultimately about not just the peaceful transfer of power, but ultimately about the effective transfer of power. Come January 20th, we'll have a president and his team that will be responsible for an extraordinary set of real challenges, the pandemic, the needs around the economy, and the list goes on and on. Those are the knowns, and there will be unknowns as well. The transition process is a monumental task. It's impossible. There's no private sector analog. It's so large. You think about the contours of our government, $5 trillion, 4 million people, half of them military reservists and in uniform, hundreds of operating units, and as the chairman has already identified, the 4,000 political appointees that need to be brought in. It's a massive task, and the history is that it takes a long time to get it done. The history is also terrific to see that Congress has done so many updates of it and has learned from past practice. We are obviously not done yet. This is still the middle of the race, and therefore everything we're talking about is really an interim assessment, but there are real opportunities for improvement. The partnership and its Center for Presidential Transition has been at this work for a very long time, since 2008. We've helped every team get ready, from McCain to Obama, Romney, Clinton, Trump, and now the Biden team. So thanks to this committee for the updates you did just this year. We will do a review of what's happened when it is all over. But in the meanwhile, we do have a set of 10 interim recommendations captured in my testimony. And I'm going to hit 7 of them if I can very quickly. The first, where there seems to be unanimous view on this, we do need to clarify the standard for post-election transition support. It should be a ministerial decision. It should be clear, and it should be a low bar. This is not about deciding who's president. This is deciding whether someone is going to get the information they need and the help they need to be ready to govern if they're in charge on January 20th. Number 2, we need to make more support available pre-election. And this will actually help in a very substantial way, this first question around clarifying the standard. Congress has already done a lot of great work about lengthening the runway, so there's more pre-election activity done in transition planning. One of the best examples of this is in 2004, when, in light of the 2001 attacks, Congress came back and said, we're going to allow for security clearances, interim security clearances, to be done pre-election. And that was extremely important. And we believe that there are many things that could be done that would move forward some of the support, whether it's the Office of Government Ethics doing reviews blindly pre-election, or many other places where you can actually help the transition teams do work pre-election so they don't actually have to do it post-election. And so they're even better ready than they are today. Number 3, and very importantly, we need to reduce the number of political appointees and those that require Senate confirmation. The biggest task that an incoming team has to do, and it's overwhelming, is to get 4,000 people in place. 4,000 isn't a magic number. It's a number that's actually grown over time. It's doubled since 1960 overall, and the number of Senate confirmed positions have increased by 20% since 1980. If you reduce the number, you make it a lot easier for a new team to come in, and you'll make our government work even better. Senator McCain actually introduced legislation in 2010 to do just this and identified $800 million that could be saved over 10 years by cutting the number of political appointees in half. Number four, we do need to stop Schedule F. We have too many political appointees. The last thing we need to do is create, 10, 100x number of political appointees. That's not how you get effective government. That's not how you make sure we have efficiency in our government. We need a professionalized civil service that will ensure that our problems are addressed in the most cost-effective ways. Schedule F runs exactly contrary to that. Number five, we also need to look at the burrowing rules, where there are some requirements that are relatively new, that the reports to Congress, they should be public. And I think we need to review to see whether the actual transfer of a political appointee to a career civil service position should actually have a higher standard itself. We also need, sixth, information. We need a modernized plum book. We should have real-time information about who the political appointees are, not just the Senate confirmed ones, but the entire 4,000. And lastly, we also need to update the Federal Vacancies Act. We've seen a bunch of issues associated with that. We can do better. And then finally, and the most important thing I can say right now is Congressman Sarbanes, I too joined the list of huge fans of your father, who was a towering public servant. You have done remarkable work yourself. I'm sure he was very, very proud of you. And I just want to give you my condolences and thank you for following in his footsteps.
Thank you, Max. John, did you want to respond? Okay.
Yeah, quickly, thank you, Max, and the others who've acknowledged my father's work. It's been quite overwhelming the last few days, the tributes and remembrances that have come in. But the constant theme, which is being echoed here today, is that he was a workhorse, not a show horse. He put his head down. He just wanted to help people. He did that every single day, and he did it in a quiet but steady and determined fashion. So thank you for paying your respects. I appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Ms. Brown, you are welcome, and we look forward to your 5-minute testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Connolly, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Members Heiss and Comey, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. As Chairman Connolly indicated, I served as co-director of agency review for the Obama-Biden transition. Since then, I've participated in nonpartisan confidential convenings organized by Max's partnership to brief presidential campaigns for both parties on the importance of an effective transition and what that entails. I've also been on the other side of a transition when, as counsel to Vice President Gore, I helped oversee an orderly transition out of the White House after Vice President Gore conceded the 2000 election to George W. Bush. Presidential transitions are times of vulnerability for our country. Not only is there a change in president, there is simultaneously a change in leadership at every executive branch agency. Risks range from delays to oversights to errors, and on the national security front, to being caught flat-footed by a savvy adversary with ill intent. It is therefore vital that the transition of power from one presidential administration to the next be as seamless as possible. No business would ever choose to have their entire leadership leave on one day. The only reason the executive branch is able to do so successfully every 4 or 8 years, including during times of crisis, is because of the cooperation of the outgoing administration and the professionalism and expertise of career civil servants. This is not a partisan issue. This is about the efficient and effective functioning of government for the people it serves. I personally benefited from such cooperation when I became assistant to the president and staff secretary. I entered the White House on the afternoon of the inauguration and found an office that had little more than furniture and a computer with a wiped hard drive. I was expected to start work immediately. My ability to do so seamlessly was due to the fact that during the transition, I had met with Raul Yanes, the final staff secretary to President Bush, and his predecessor, then Judge Kavanaugh, as well as John Podesta and Todd Stern, staff secretaries for President Clinton. All had been gracious with their time, forthcoming and helpful in advising me how to navigate my new job. They continued a long, nonpartisan tradition that through many administrations has benefited both new office holders and the country they serve. The transition from President Bush's administration to that of President Obama was successful because of the extensive cooperation between the two. President Bush set the tone for collaboration from his White House staff to cabinet secretaries and agency heads and their political and career staffs. The federal government is a complex bureaucracy, making any transition a daunting task and a massive amount of work, even when one has the full allotment of time between Election Day and Inauguration Day. Agency review, which is just one piece of a transition, entails establishing a structure and process to review over 100 executive departments, agencies, and commissions. Our structure involved over 500 people with specific teams for each agency. Thanks to the strong working relationship with the White House, the members of our agency review teams had received security clearances prior to the election, and we had agreed on a process enabling teams to go into the agencies soon after. I met with the GSA transition team the morning after the election, and our teams then spent days meeting with career employees who were consummate professionals and absolutely indispensable to the efficient and smooth transition. If we ran into any glitches, we were able to raise them with the executive director of the transition, who resolved them expeditiously with his White House counterpart. Why does all of this matter? The goal of agency review is to complete a timely and thorough review of agencies in the White House to provide the president-elect, cabinet appointees, and their key advisors with the critical information needed to begin governing the minute they take office. The information collected informs the policy and budget planning process and personnel selection during the transition, and ensures that new administration officials can hit the ground running when they take office the day after inauguration. Agency review ensures that new appointees will know what they will immediately confront when they walk in the door. What pressing legislative, litigation, regulatory, budgetary, or programmatic matters will require immediate so they don't drop any balls or miss an opportunity to act. Agency review also identifies key opportunities to begin implementing the president-elect's policy priorities at each agency. This work, which must occur at every agency, is critical to protecting and serving the American people. The challenges facing the country today are even more daunting than those we faced in 2008, making cooperation between the outgoing and incoming administrations more important than ever. I look forward to answering your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify. And let me please add my condolences regarding Senator Sarbanes. He was a remarkable public leader. I'm a Maryland resident, and so have for a long time followed him and been grateful to him. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a matter of fact, I'm going to call, out of respect for the memory of his dad and for the wonderful work he's doing too, I'm going to call on Mr. Sarbanes for the first questioning. Before I do that, let me just run down for Ms. Norton the order. Obviously, she could change it, but it's going to go Mr. Sarbanes, Mr. Heiss, Ms. Maloney, Mr. Palmer, Ms. Spear, Mr. Comer, and then Brenda Lawrence, Delegate Plaskett, Congressman Lynch, Congressman Raskin, and I'll probably do cleanup. In just a little bit, Ms. Norton, I'm going to ask you if you would to run the hearing while I go and cast 2 votes. I have myself and a proxy. I'll be as fast as I can and try to come back, but I really appreciate your willingness to do that. If that's okay with you, Ms. Norton. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I now call on Mr. Sarbanes for his 5 minutes of questioning. What? Oh, sorry about that. Miss Spear, are you there? Miss Lawrence? Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Raskin? All right, Ms. Maloney, are you prepared to go? Mr. Raskin, are you there? Well, all right. You know what? I think, Ms. Norton, normally I go last, but if you don't mind, I'll go now and then hand over the gavel to you while I go vote.
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Heiss, I believe you are there, so you would be the first on your side of the aisle. People are probably voting. Okay, on November 9th, I recognize myself for my 5 minutes of questioning. On November 9th, days after Joe Biden was projected as the winner of the presidential election, President Trump actually instructed leaders of federal agencies not to recognize the Biden victory and to block cooperation with President-elect Biden's transition team. In addition to those actions, President Trump even proposed the treacherous idea of state legislatures overturning election results to favor him. Such actions clearly could undermine trust in democracy, and in fact do, and further hamper the incoming administration's ability to access information and get ready to govern. Ms. Brown, when you were co-chair of agency review for the Obama-Biden transition project, how important was it for the incumbent administration to acknowledge the process and to work with you rather than actively against you?
This is,
President
Rice is a
Obama had,
Republican, I assume.
can you,
This is the entire order.
Okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
And then I think you'll just go when
So that we can hear Ms. Brown. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Brown.
Thank you. President Obama himself has often cited President Bush's collaboration as absolutely indispensable to his transition. They worked very closely, administrations worked very closely together. As you indicated, President Obama was taking office during a recession, and it was a time of crisis, and President Bush actually his team worked with our team to tee up decisions and say, which decisions do you want us to make? Which decisions do you all want to make? And in order to ensure that at such a time of crisis, the transition was as smooth as possible. And we were welcomed into agencies. We were able to get to work immediately. And it made all the difference. There's quite a lot of information that you access during agency review that is not public. So it's not until that transition period post-election that you are able to get access to classified information, for example. And so certainly with regard to national security matters, it is vitally important that the incoming administration be fully briefed so that you don't have some type of a gap after they take office.
Thank you. I think that that lot of point you make about national security, I'm looking at the Center for Presidential Transition, identifying a number of national security issues that are affected by the length of the transition and the cooperation or non-cooperation. Just beginning with a review of 17 intelligence agencies and their responsibilities and their issues. A number of other key officials that they have to place into place, to say nothing of ongoing international security issues that matter to us, right? There's a war that just kind of got, semi-settled in the Gorno-Karabakh. There's an active war in Ethiopia in the Tigray province. There's, active Russian meddling in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. There's Chinese activity in the Indian border that has gone kinetic. I mean, there are lots of issues, plus terrorism and plus the Middle East. And I mean, the United States can't interrupt its responsibilities in the world, and national security looms very, very large, and it needs to be seamless to underscore your point, I think.
Chairman Connolly, I might add, I believe the 9/11 Commission actually referred to the delay in when Bush came into office because of Bush v. Gore, that his very abbreviated, I think it was 50+ days of transition, was part of the reason that it took him much longer to get his national security team into place. I've cited that as one possible reason for 9/11.
You're exactly right. It was quite explicit that they cited that as a contributing factor to the unreadiness of the United States government to the threat that ultimately tragically materialized in 9/11. Thank you. On November 23, the head of the GSA, Emily Murphy, finally ascertained the winner of the election, allowing President-elect Biden to access post-election resources and information. In her letter, which I now insert into the hearing record, she suggested that Congress should create clearer guide rails on what it means for the GSA administrator to ascertain who the president and vice president-elect are. On the other hand, as early as November 8th, the Partnership for Public Service and 4 former leaders of presidential transitions released a statement saying, "We congratulate Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris on their successful and historic campaign for the White House. While there will be legal disputes requiring adjudication, the outcome is sufficiently clear that the transition process must now begin." I ask that this release also be included in the hearing record at this point. Mr. Steyer, among those who signed on to that letter I just referred to were Josh Bolten and former Utah Governor Michael Leavitt. Those are big names in the liberal Democrat world, right?
I'm just looking at Ranking Member Heiss. Am I permitted to answer the question, given the time is run?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to clear that. Yeah, so the Center for Presidential Transition is a part of the Partnership for Public Service. It is
my question to you was, Josh Bolten and Utah Governor Michael Leavitt signed that letter. Are they liberal Democrats, to your knowledge?
My point to you is the answer is we're a nonpartisan organization, and we have leaders from both the Republican and Democratic parties.
I don't know what's hard about this, Mr. Steyer. Mr. Steyer, to your knowledge, are they liberal Democrats or are they Republicans?
Chairman Connolly, as you know, they are Republican in their party affiliation. They're Americans in their treatment of the transition.
I understand that. I'm trying to make the point that you're trying to make, if you'd cooperate, and that is that Republicans as well as Democrats signed that statement. This wasn't a partisan statement. It was a recognition of the results of a free and fair election that were fairly decisive. Would that be a fair way of describing it?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Is Mr. Heiss back?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Mr. Heiss, you're recognized for your 5 minutes of questioning. And then Ms. Norton, if you would take the gavel, I'm going to step out and go vote, and then I'll come back. Thank you so much for doing that. And Mr. Heiss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we are having some computer problems, and that may have been a part of why you couldn't find someone else a while ago to ask some questions. As I get into this, I do want to highlight the fact that a lot of the reason that we are here today, I think, is simply because the Democrats for this entire year have been pushing for vote by mail. And look, we all know when you have vote by mail, you're not going to be able to get results back in a timely fashion. We need look no further than simply ask Chairwoman Maloney about that. Her own election took over 6 weeks to get an answer finally as to who won. And now we're looking at it on a national basis, and we're here complaining that less than 3 weeks was involved in having a transition with GSA. Well, a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that we've been pushing and accepting across the country vote by mail, which is a disaster on multiple fronts. But rather than focus on the transition that is already underway, I would like to speak to the fact that the majority is holding this hearing because they're frustrated with the fact that states are exercising their right to question and investigate irregularities in this 2020 election. And frankly, I find this to be gross hypocrisy because the Democrats were consistently questioning the results of the 2016 election until recently. In fact, the talk of impeaching President Trump started before he was actually even elected. In April of 2016, Politico posted an article suggesting that Representative Alan Grayson said that Trump's insistence on building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border could lead down a path of impeachment. In 2017, Al Green and Brad Sherman, in the first year of his presidency, introduced a resolution impeaching the president due to high misdemeanors. Then there's the whole Russian collusion thing that we've already talked about, a falsely peddled narrative that went on for years and cost the taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. You have Heba Abedin, the sister of Hillary Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin, she used Facebook to call on the Justice Department to request an audit of the vote of the 2016 election. Concerns about the voting machines also are nothing new. In fact, a member of this committee on the other side of the aisle validated fears in voting machine irregularities and introduced legislation to prevent states from contracting with firms owned or influenced by non-U.S. citizens. And this bill would have impacted at least two of the very large companies, one of which would be the Dominion voting systems. And a Democratic senator, in a speech at an election security conference in Washington, D.C., said that the voting machine lobby literally, and this is a quote, literally think they are above the law. They are accountable to no one. And they have been able to hotwire the political system in certain parts of our country, end quote. So confidence in the democratic process is not a partisan issue. If we spent millions of dollars giving credence to the Russian collusion narrative, then certainly we ought to be able to give a few weeks to ensure that the election that just took place was done so with integrity. And I would think also that we should be holding legislative investigative hearings to explore the elective irregularities in order to earn back the trust of the American people. I think all of this is extremely important. Mr. Steyer, do you agree that a presidential transition doesn't just start after ascertainment or even once the candidates are declared, but the preparations for this huge undertaking should actually take place months before the election?
Absolutely. It's a very powerful point that you make there. If you're going to be ready, you have to start early. And this committee in Congress has, over time, made it easier and easier for that to happen. And I think there are some additional improvements that could be made that would reduce the concerns around ascertainment because more work would be done pre-election.
Okay, and would you agree that that actually took place?
Yes, the Biden team has followed best practice. They started early, they started smartly, and they started with good people.
Okay, thank you very much. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Next on the list, as called by the chairman, would be Mr. Sarbanes if he is finished voting. Mr. Sarbanes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Steyer, would like to begin with you and may end with you, depending on how long your answer is. But a lot of the attention around the transition tends to focus on the higher level political appointees and sort of the process by which one group is anticipating leaving and the other one is coming in. But I'd like to get your perspective from the work that you do. You know how the rank and file operate and do their jobs inside these agencies. And we're talking about professionals who care deeply about the mission of the organization that they serve. They want to do a good job. And I imagine that these transitions create a tremendous amount of anxiety for the rank and file because they want to make sure that the agency handoff is happening in a way that represents high standards and professionalism. So perhaps you could speak to what that looks like, the kind of inside mechanics. Pick an agency if you'd like as an example, and talk about what it means for that civil servant, that federal worker who cares deeply about their job and making sure that the function of the agency is being carried out at a high level, and what it means for them to have the transition done well, or for there to be problems with the transition.
So Congressman Sarbanes, a fabulous question. The reality is that it is the career workforce that is the engine room of our government. And it is vital that that career workforce is tended well and engaged well by new political teams if our country is going to be able to address the critical issues that we have in front of us, the economy, you name it. Quick example, you said, to give you an example of an agency, the Small Business Administration in this past year had to put out 5 million loans, which is 80 times what it's done previously. And that was obviously to help critical small businesses across the country. That's a phenomenal workload, and that work is being done by career civil servants. So you ask, what's the experience of the workforce, the career workforce in a transition? The motivation of that career workforce is to get mission done, and it needs leadership in place to help provide policy guidance. The transition is often a time of uncertainty, and that uncertainty causes challenge. We all know that in any management context, uncertainty is the bane of good management. And so in a transition context, it's very important for the existing leadership to be supporting the career workforce and continuing the work of government, and that the handoff in leadership is smooth. One of the first tasks of any new leadership team should be to engage effectively that career workforce, because their ability to get stuff done is going to depend on that relationship. And that smooth handoff is exactly what we're talking about here. It's one of the reasons why I think we should have fewer political appointees, because it would make that handoff easier, and you would have leaders that stayed around longer. One of the big challenges in the context of the system we have right now is we have short-term leaders that don't align against the long-term problems that government is intended to address, or the health of the institutions that they're in fact responsible for. Last point, if you look at our testimony, we believe the political leaders should be held accountable for good performance and for their effective management of the career workforce. And then we would have better return on taxpayer dollars for more effective government.
Let me thank you. That's exactly what I was interested in hearing. Let me do a follow-up here. If you had the political leadership in an agency resisting the transition for any period of time, could that translate into actually having rank and file staffers in these agencies effectively being told to sit on their hands, so they're literally stuck not being able to perform the duties that would ensure a smooth transition? Could it take on that appearance?
So one of the improvements that this committee and Congress helped make this last year is to ensure that it's a career leader in charge of the transition preparation in every agency. That was an improvement that was quite important that you just did, and I think makes a big difference. But fundamentally, everyone should be on the same team, and that team is to make sure that our government is working effectively. The political team coming out needs to offboard as effectively as the incoming team did. Lisa talked about the Bush exit. It's the gold standard of handoff, and we should use that as the model for how to do that right.
Thank you very much. And I thank the gentleman whose time has now expired. I now call on Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I do want to express my condolences to my friend and colleague, Mr. Sarbanes. You're in my prayers, especially this time of year. And I lost my dad in 2012, and I think about him often, and I hope, and I know you do, you're going to have many fond memories, but you will miss him.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Steyer, are you aware of previous precedent set by the Democrats in delaying the assertment of a president-elect in circumstances of legally contested elections?
I think the last time, I'm not sure if the reference is to the 2000 election, the last time you saw a delay in the ascertainment was in the 2000 election, and it had real consequence. We've already heard about the 9/11 report itself. You know, if you look at the numbers, there are 1,200 Senate confirmed positions. President Obama was the high watermark of getting his senior team in place. In the first 100 days, he was able to get 69 in. That's the high watermark. But President Bush, in light of the short and transition period, was only able to get half that number in the first 100 days. So,
well, I would like to point out, though, in that Bush 43 transition, that for me, one of the really problematic issues related to 9/11 was the delay over the confirmation of John Ashcroft as the United States Attorney General, which was entirely political, but that's another topic for another time. And I do appreciate your answer on that, because it was the former Clinton GSA Administrator David Barham, who testified before this subcommittee about the delaying the assertment. And former Congressman Dante Fussell was quoted by my good friend, Mr. Connolly. I just want to read you a quote from the hearing regarding the legislation that governs this from 1963. He said, "There's nothing in the act that requires the administrator to make a decision which is in his own judgment he could not make. If he could not determine the parent's successful candidate, he would not authorize the expenditure of funds to anyone, and he should not." But I think in this case, as the process has gone along, the GSA administrator has made a decision and the process has begun. Would you agree with that, Mr. Tyre? You're muted. I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thank you for that. I'm competing with the clerk on who's unmuting muted, so we're going back and forth a bit there. But the answer is that I'm very impressed with the fact that I hear bipartisan interest in clarifying the standard for ascertainment. I think it needs to happen. We need to make sure that this is viewed, in fact, as a ministerial decision, that there isn't as much discretion involved, so that we can see more investment in transition activity faster.
Well, again, quoting former Congressman Fussell, it says, in the unlikely proposition that would happen, and he was, at that time, it only happened 3 times. Obviously, this is the 5th time. He said that if the administrator had any question in his mind, he simply would not make any designation in order to make services available as provided by the Act. With that in mind, and I don't think the Act really contains the guidelines that assist the GSA administrator. Do you think we need to make some changes to amend the Act?
Absolutely. I think we do, or you do rather, and to amend it to make sure that you have clarity that this is a low bar. And as I indicated earlier, you could also reduce the importance of that decision by allowing more work to be done pre-election. So this doesn't become as big a gate as it currently is.
I appreciate your response, and I need to go vote, so I'm going to yield the balance of my time, Madam Chairman, and I thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. By order of seniority next would be Miss Maloney. If she is not back, by order of seniority, my questions would be next. I do want to express my condolences to my friend and neighbor, my next door neighbor from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, along with Republicans, as Republicans and Democrats have already done on this committee. I want to indicate that the ranking member Heiss cited Rush versus Gore as taking even more time to certify, but I hope that we understand that was because of the fact that the election had not been called, I believe, in Florida because of Hanging Chad. The election was called for all intents and purposes on November 3rd in this occasion. My question goes to a serious concern I have about the relationship of the transition and its 20 days loss to the public health emergency that we're now experiencing. Our record high daily case counts, even though there is, I'm happy to note, hope on the horizon that a vaccine will become available in a few days. My question first is to Ms. Kumar. How important is a seamless transition threatened in the midst of a national health crisis? Ms. Kumar?
Yeah, I'm now unmuted. It is terribly important to get a hold of the pandemic, and in order to do that, the Biden team is needed to have information on the distribution process and all of the different producers of vaccines, of the differences between them, and much of that information.
Witnesses. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that information could not be provided until the administrator ascertained a president-elect. And what ended up happening was that the Biden team would then have to do workarounds and talk to people who were knowledgeable who had been in the administration earlier, which is not a good substitute for getting the latest information, which is required on this. So that is a good example of the kinds of crises that occur that you need to have the transition start as early as possible, and with the detailed information provided to the next person who's coming into the presidency.
Yes, this pandemic does present much more than a wrinkle for the transition. Ms. Brown, how could delays in assessing national health information affect plans to distribute and administer the vaccine?
So I think Martha has addressed this. I think you really want to make sure is that President-elect Biden's team is fully briefed on Operation Warp Speed, knows what CDC is doing, knows what DOD's distribution plans are, and how are they working with states already, how much vaccine has been ordered, over what period of time, all these questions. It is, as you will know, an organizational challenge to distribute the vaccine across the country. And so the nitty-gritty detail on all of that is extremely important for the country to make sure that when they take office, that there's no blip in that distribution.
Well, Mr. Steyer, finally, as we look at what the president-elect is doing on the pandemic response, can you indicate what he is doing right on this response, given these delays?
So thank you, Congresswoman. As been noted earlier, the Biden team got going very early with professionals to pre-election, and I think the most important thing they did right is starting very early to prepare for the possibility that they would ultimately be in charge, and bringing in real expertise around public health issues to get up to speed and to look at the different options. Obviously this is, as you just heard from everybody else and yourself, a huge task. And I think the only point I would offer beyond what has already been made is that there are a lot of unknowns. And one of the more tricky aspects of this for an incoming team will be not only knowing what's happened already, but being up to speed, having the relationships both with the career workforce and with colleagues across the government so that they can deal with a fast-moving and challenging situation and make good choices. That's really what we need great leadership for.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. Next would be Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer, are you there?
Yes, I am. And
you may proceed.
Thank you. Before I begin my questions, I too want to offer my sincere condolences to Mr. Sarbanes. Let me begin with Mr. Steyer. Joe Biden has said that the outreach from federal agencies has been sincere, that it has not been begrudging so far, and I don't expect it to be. Is that sentiment consistent with what you're hearing about how the transition's going right now?
It is. I think that, again, it's the career workforce that's most central to providing information to the Biden team. My understanding is that those communications are now happening, and they're happening well. There are pockets of challenge, but there's also an escalation process in place. And I want to doff my hat in particular to Chris Liddell, who was the #2 in the Romney Readiness Project, is now Deputy White House Chief of Staff. He is expert on these issues, and I think has been really a phenomenal leader in government in trying to make sure that the right preparation happened and the right things are happening now.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because I don't think that's the message that's being portrayed by a lot of the mainstream media. So I'm really happy that we've had this hearing to get the truth out. Ms. Kumar, let me ask you, Clay Johnson, who led George W. Bush's transition team, has said that Biden, quote, can't wait to be sure that the president-elect really is the president-elect. And his advisors have to hurry up and move forward. Do you agree with his sentiment that candidates' transition team should already be working on identifying key senior staff and cabinet positions even before the official GSA ascertainment takes place?
Yes, I think that all of us would agree on that. That the earlier you get started, the better transition you're going to have. In Clay Johnson's case, he began in about well over a year before the transition actually occurred. Was his executive director and worked on the appointments process, because there's so much to do. You have to set up a system where you're going to handle all of the resumes that come in, where you have, I think the Obama people had over 200,000 resumes come in, and you have to line up your team of in figuring out the choices of what are your priority issues, and then work at filling those posts early. And you can see that one of the first things that Biden did was filling a task force on the virus, because that was his priority issue.
Ms. Brown, you served as co-director of agency review for the Obama-Biden transition team in 2008, 2009. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Can you describe how agency review works to ensure that a president and their team is ready to hit the ground running on day one?
So they essentially, teams go into each agency and try to do their best to learn what are the salient issues, essentially what's going to hit you in the face when you walk in the door. And then what are the opportunities for implementing the president-elect's agenda? So what this means is sitting down in multiple meetings with career staff involved in the different elements of each agency. If you think about something like HHS or DOJ, obviously they have an enormous number of essentially sub-agencies. And so each one of those you need to go into, make sure you understand what are they working on at the time. And often agency review focuses on what's going to happen in the first 100 days. And so that you really make sure that you are ready when you come in, you know what's going to be on your plate, and whether it's litigation, regulation, a programmatic issue. And if I might add to what Martha and Max added, one, even if a president-elect has spent a lot of time before the election thinking about who they're going to nominate, which I agree is incredibly important, you need to back that up. You still have to do background checks on everyone, and that becomes a bottleneck. It is something with the FBI or OPM, that is something that often slows down the nominations, and is something that I believe can't happen until after the election. So that's, and thinking about enhancements that
the gentleman's time has expired. Next would be Ms. Maloney, if she is back. If she is not, next would be Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses who are here. This is very important information that we are going through, and I appreciate all of your perspectives. The Trump-Biden presidential transition is the first time that the majority of a transition will be conducted virtually due to the pandemic. In fact, since March of 2020, most of the federal workforce has been working from home to adhere to social distancing guidelines. Given the rise in coronavirus cases, it does not appear that teleworking is going to go away anytime soon. In addition to dealing with the uncooperative outgoing administration, the Biden transition team is in the throes of building a new administration in an abbreviated transition and virtually. Mr. Steyer, what challenges has the Biden transition team faced due to this virtual operation, if you are aware of any?
Congresswoman, you did such a great job of outlining the challenge. It is unbelievable in the best of circumstances how large this task is and how meaningful and difficult it is. But it is clearly way more difficult in the context of the pandemic. And as you noted, the Biden team is forced in at least two ways to have to address doing things virtually for itself, for its own team. It's having to perform all the functions of a startup and a very intensive startup done virtually. And then it's having to interact largely with the federal workforce virtually as well. And that includes obviously engaging with potential appointees that you might ordinarily have more face-to-face contact with, in-person contact than you can in this context. So, I think that the Biden team really, deserves a lot of credit for the intensity of its efforts very early on. They saw this. They began organizing in the springtime. So they have been preparing for having to do these things. It doesn't make the problem go away. It just means that they're better able to manage it, and they've got great people doing it. I do think that one other point you made there, though, about the federal workforce being virtual, I would hope also at some point this committee can come back to the fact that the federal workforce has done an exceptional job of acting virtually, and there's a lot of good lessons learned from that. That government can be done even better, more efficiently, more cheaply by the virtual activity that's taking place now.
Well, Mr. Starr, that was leading to my second question, was that experience of doing this transition virtually can give us, inform future presidential transitions and how to do it in a more truncated, potentially a cheaper fashion. I think this would go towards your discussion earlier about maybe there not being a necessity for having as many political appointments or as many Senate confirmed appointments, not having to take people around to all of the senators to have these discussions. Or do we need to do it, and should it be virtual, and will that speed up the process? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
So certainly on your first issue, I 100% agree with that. And again, I mentioned earlier, Senator McCain had introduced legislation in 2010, noting that it would save $800 million over 10 years to cut the number of political appointees in half. And actually, the number of political appointees, the 4,000 that are used today, is double what they were in 1960. So that's one plain lesson. And I think you're exactly right that reducing the number of overall political appointees and those, especially those that are requiring Senate confirmation, would make this process a lot easier. The Senate is a small pipe, and a lot is pushed through it. And it frankly is undoable to get 1,250 people in real time. On the virtual point, it's a very interesting one that you raised. I noted earlier that we're still midway through the race. I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons when this is all over. We've always done an assessment after the fact. It's taken a bunch of time because there's a lot of information to gather. But I'm confident that there will be improvements and efficiencies that are available that we can adopt a longer term by doing things virtually.
Thank you. And with the short time that I have remaining, Ms. Brown, there are review teams that physically need to enter federal buildings to do things such as reviewing classified material. Given your experience with that review process, how might this hinder the transition team's ability to be fully prepared to take office on day one?
Congresswoman, you're absolutely right. There's certain work that can't be done virtually. As Max has indicated, I think we've all become unfortunately accustomed to communicating this way, but it is not a perfect substitute. It is harder to suss out the individual that you are talking to. You cannot communicate classified information over Zoom. I think that is obviously the biggest challenge. And so that needs to be done in person. I will say it should be able to be done in person. Right now, people are working at supermarkets and driving buses, and federal employees who need to be at work are at work. And so I think that is something that we, as a government, should still be able to accomplish with, of course, all of the right safety precautions. But you are quite correct. That is a piece of it that needs to be done in person.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to question these witnesses, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman whose time has expired. Is Ms. Maloney back? If not, we'll go to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My thoughts too are with my friend John Sarbanes and his family. His father, Senator Sarbanes, was a model public servant who believed in public service and was a champion of government and the people who served us in it. And he will be sharply missed by the people of Maryland and by the people of our country. Madam Chair, this administration has been messing with the civil service. First, the president issued executive orders gutting collective bargaining and attacking unions. Then they shut the government down. Then they tried illegally to abolish the Office of Personnel Management. Now, President Trump has issued an executive order calling for the creation of a new Schedule F, which would allow reclassification of hundreds of thousands of expert employees in the federal civil service and take away their ability to appeal adverse actions taken against them, making them easy to remove and easy to replace with unqualified or less qualified political operatives. Mr. Steyer, you run a group that promotes nonpartisan good government. Does this executive order make government better? Does it promote the value of expertise?
Thank you, Congressman Raskin, and the answer is clearly not. It's really a fundamental attack on the core notion that we need a merit-based system, professionals to deal with the really difficult problems that we face as a nation. And it is frightening. And I would just offer the additional point that there's been some conversation that this could be easily overturned by an incoming President Biden. And my view is that the damage that could be done between now and next administration is really serious. And to the extent that this can be stopped, it would be to the people's benefit, because ultimately it will lead to incredible inefficiencies, incredible harm to the public and to public servants. It's worth noting that our system was based, fundamentally, it started after a president was assassinated by a would-be job seeker. And there was a recognition that that's not the way to run a government, that we actually needed people who were selected for their expertise because they were public stewards and had the ability to solve big problems. Those are the ones that we needed in government.
You recently wrote an op-ed in USA Today, which, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record, if I could.
Accepted.
Thank you. And in that piece, you said that these actions could make our government less accountable and less effective. But Mr. Steyer, you've actually called for reform of the civil service. I'm wondering, well, why do you think this is not the reform that is required right now?
So thank you again for that opportunity to answer that question. There's no doubt that our system does need reform. You look at our pay system right now, it was created in 1949. I don't know of any other organization that's running successfully with a pay system from 1949. So there's definite modernization that needs to occur. The challenge with the Schedule F is that it undermines the basic premise that our career workforce should be selected for their expertise, and they should not be gotten rid of unless there is a problem, there's a cause, a real cause for getting rid of them. The Schedule F, what it would enable is a political appointee to fire a whistleblower, someone who's identified waste, fraud, and abuse, and therefore gets fired for it, or that person never raises their hand because they know they can be fired. That does not serve the American people.
Thank you. Ms. Brown, you ran the agency review teams for President Obama in the 2008 transition. How important was the presence of career civil servants to you during that transition process?
Thank you for that question. It is absolutely indispensable. Most of our meetings when we went into agencies were with career civil servants. If you think about it, it is only the very top level of these enormous agencies where the of political appointees. Everybody else is a career employee. And the individuals who really know the ins and outs of programs, who are doing the work of the government every day, are career civil servants. And so they're the ones that you really want to be talking to and need to be talking to as you're learning about what is going on in that agency during agency review.
Well, I appreciate that. Madam Chair, I just want to say that OMB's identified 425 people, nearly 90% of its staff, for conversion to this Schedule F. And this creates real risks that thousands of people will be removed from their jobs right in the midst of the pandemic, right in the middle of the holidays, and right when we need them most for this presidential transition. We must not allow this plan to go forward, and I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman for those remarks. His time has expired. The next person who's available appears to be Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear, are you back?
I am. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to focus on midnight rulemaking. In the final months of any presidential administration, there is a high volume of rules that are issued. This is oftentimes called midnight rulemaking because in the attempts in the waning hours of administration to achieve political policy goals, they do them in the dark of night. So it's an endless problem. It's gone on from one administration to the next. I'm particularly concerned about what might happen at the end of this administration. And I know that Chairman Connolly has introduced the Midnight Rulemaking Review Act that would require GAO to create a kind of spreadsheet of major rules promulgated near the end of an administration. So, Ms. Brown, would incoming administrations benefit from a list of regulations that an outgoing administration promulgated at the 11th hour?
Definitely. Those are regulations that they're going to need to be addressing the minute they walk in the door. So it would be extremely helpful to have those.
So, but having said that, the only options to reverse these last minute regulations are the Congressional Review Authority, correct?
So it depends upon the stage that the rule is in. If it's proposed, then you could act quickly to pull it back. If it's final, you're absolutely right. You're either going to have to go through the Congressional Review Act or go through formal rulemaking.
And in that situation, it's a majority of members of both houses to overturn a last-minute regulation, correct?
Yep, it is not an easy process. You are correct.
Ms. Kumar, thank you. Ms. Kumar, you've studied presidential transitions. What have you found in terms of attempts to sow legacies through the use of regulatory process at the end of an administration? And you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. As Lisa has talked about the problem, and one of the things that it does is it starts a new administration on a negative note of things, particularly if there's a party change, that they then have to spend their time, rather than working on their priorities, making sure that they address the rules that have been left behind. In the Bush administration, at the end of the administration, Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff and also was running the transition out, sought to address this issue by encouraging the department secretaries, by giving them a timetable that they had for issuing rules. And they had his memo was on May 9th in 2008. And so it said, except in extraordinary circumstances, regulations to be finalized in this administration should be proposed no later than June 1st, 2008, and final regulations issued no later than November 1st. So that was an attempt by the sitting administration to get hold of the process, and it had mixed success because the department secretaries are dealing with the hot button issues, and they put this towards the end, so there were a lot of appeals that they had to deal with. But it was an internal attempt to deal with it.
So has that same process been used in the Trump administration? Do you know?
No.
And we don't know, or no, it hasn't.
As far as I know, no, it is not. I think there have been a lot of rules rules that have been issued. One of the first things that an administration does when they come in is they stop the printing of the Federal Register for any things that might have been done at the very end, because if they're not printed in the Federal Register, then they're not they're not they're not live.
All right, thank you. I just want to point out that the Congressional Review Act has been used to overturn 17 rules. 16 of them were overturned by President Trump in his first 2 years, and these were rules of the Obama administration that protected water, fair pay, resource management, and unemployment compensation. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady's time has expired and the chairman is back, I believe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for doing such an able job, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, you made the point that Republicans had signed a letter announcing the election to be over and calling for ascertainment of a winner. I would like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record an article in the Washington Post by Beth Newberger, who's a GSA Associate Administration for Public Affairs during the Clinton administration. The title of the article is "Emily Murphy Was Right Not to Recognize Biden's win until now." So basically, what we have is a Democrat, one who is very much intimately involved in the process, saying that the administrator, Murphy, was correct. I'd like to enter it into the record, please, sir.
Without objection, it is so ordered. Thank you. And I just want you to know that apparently I'm in good company with President-elect Biden. I won my reelection with 72% of the vote, my best in a competitive race ever, by a margin of 140,000 votes. And my Republican opponent has yet to concede. I not only was certified as the winner, I now have my election certificate ready for framing. So it's kind of a common illness, apparently, among some, to just not recognize the results of elections. I want to thank all of our panel, and I want to particularly thank my dear friend Eleanor Holmes Norton for filling in for me while I had to cast several votes with my own proxy on two bills before the House floor. This is a very important hearing, and I thank my friend Jody Heiss for his contribution. I mean, I do think we can, look, we're not going to agree on some politics, a lot of politics surrounding this issue, but I do think that Mr. Heiss and I and others on the subcommittee and the full committee can try to find common ground, though, in dealing with some of the crevices that have been exposed that need to be fixed in law. You know, Emily Murphy herself, the GSA administrator, urged Congress to pass legislation to address the ambiguity around the process of ascertainment and to better define what ascertainment is and when it's triggered, so that that burden is not in the hands of some future administrator to make that decision. And I think my friend Mr. Heiss might be receptive to trying to address that legislatively, along with some other issues we've got.
I am, Mr. Chairman. I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss. I welcome that collaboration, and let's try to do that. Mr. Starr has laid out a number of legislative suggestions from the partnership that I think we also ought to take a look at. They're nonpartisan. God knows Mr. Starr has gone out of his way to stress that. But that's, you know, that's a good thing. And I do think there's fertile ground there for further legislative action. In my own opening statement, I talked about sort of the midnight regulation process. And again, that's building on bipartisan legislation utilizing GAO as an analytical tool to try to bring to bear substantive judgment on, well, what happened, what's good, what's bad, what's indifferent, and what, if anything, we can and should do about it. So I want to thank all of our witnesses for their remarks. I want to commend my colleagues for participating in, I think, a very timely and important conversation. I want to insert into the record a statement of support for the hearing from the White House Transition Project. I also want to thank our able staff. These are not easy circumstances in which to organize a hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for their cooperation and their patience with the technology and with the schedule of the House. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the record. And if you go through the chair, we'll make sure they are entered into the record. I ask our witnesses to respond as promptly as possible to any written questions we forward to them. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.